Thanksgiving morning, 2016. Interstate 5 in Yolo County, California. It is still dark, just before 4:30 a.m., when a motorist spots something moving near the highway on-ramp. A woman, frantic, waving a piece of fabric in the freezing air. When authorities arrive, they find a scene constructed directly from a collective suburban nightmare. A 34-year-old mother of two, missing for 22 days. She is bound with heavy chains around her waist and wrists, secured tightly with hose clamps. Her signature blonde hair has been roughly chopped off. She is starved, weighing just 87 pounds. Her face is severely bruised, the bridge of her nose broken. There is a literal brand burned into the flesh of her right shoulder. She tells investigators a story of unimaginable terror. 2 Hispanic women, an abduction at gunpoint while she was out for a morning jog. A dark, desolate room. Constant, inexplicable torment. For weeks, the nation had held its breath. Neighbors tied yellow ribbons around trees. Strangers funded massive search efforts. And now the miracle. She survived. If you watch any Sherri Papini documentary, you will see the same archival footage of a community weeping in relief. The system had worked. A husband had his wife back. 2 toddlers had their mother. But the story she told the police and the world wasn't just a lie. It was a production. The bruises, the starvation, the chains, the brand searing her skin. The most terrifying aspect of November 2016 wasn't a pair of phantom kidnappers roaming rural California in a dark SUV. It was the realization of what a person is capable of doing to their own body and to the minds of their own family, just to make the world watch. The victim and the architect of her suffering were the exact same person. She orchestrated a nightmare and placed herself in the center of it, soaking in the terrified empathy of an entire country. And the most unsettling part isn't that she fooled everyone. It's the quiet, meticulous 3-week period where she sat in a bedroom, completely safe, deciding exactly how much damage she needed to inflict on herself to make the illusion unbreakable. Redding, California, sits at the northernmost edge of the Sacramento Valley. It is a city defined by its geography, surrounded by the quiet, towering presence of Mount Shasta and the sprawling, dense wilderness of the Trinity Alps. It is a place of endless pine trees, harsh summer heat, and crisp, quiet autumns. People move to Redding for the space. They stay for the safety. It is the kind of community where the neighborhood watch is entirely unofficial, where people notice if a strange car idles too long at the end of a cul-de-sac, and where the boundaries of a comfortable, predictable life feel permanent. This was the environment that Sherri Papini inhabited. But she didn't just live in Redding. She was, in many ways, the idealized manifestation of it. To understand the sheer magnitude of the deception that would later unfold, you first have to understand the architecture of the life she presented to the world. It was not a casual existence. It was a meticulously curated museum of domestic perfection, and Sherri was its tireless curator. At 34 years old, Sherri was striking. Petite, hovering right around 5 feet and 3 inches tall, with long, carefully maintained blonde hair and a bright, familiar smile. She looked exactly like the woman you might see in a local television commercial for a family-owned apple orchard or a community bake sale. And that was exactly how she was perceived. To understand her, you have to understand where she came from. Sherri Louise Grafe was born on June 11, 1982, and raised in Mount Shasta, a small mountain town less than an hour north of the community she'd later come to dominate as a suburban icon. It was a childhood spent in the shadow of the same volcanic peak that would later loom over the search parties combing the wilderness for her. She married Keith Papini in October of 2009, and by the time she vanished, she had spent roughly 7 years building the identity that would define her to the world. Before she became a full-time homemaker, she had worked for AT&T. In 2016, months before her disappearance, that job disappeared. She was laid off. It is worth sitting with that detail for a moment because it complicates the easy version of this story. The Supermom identity was not simply a lifestyle choice. It was in part a retreat. When the external structure of a career collapsed, the internal structure of the home had to expand to fill the space, had to become even more flawless, even more visible, even more essential to her sense of who she was. A woman who had just lost an external source of validation had every reason to double down on the one source of validation she still controlled completely. Friends and family didn't just think she was a good mother. They had a specific nickname for her. They called her Supermom. This wasn't a title she earned through grand, heroic gestures. It was built through a relentless, daily commitment to an aesthetic of traditional, effortless domesticity, the kind of commitment that looks effortless specifically because of how much invisible work goes into maintaining it. She was the mother who baked elaborate, multi-tiered cakes for toddlers' birthdays. She was the neighbor who meticulously wrapped holiday gifts in custom paper with perfectly symmetrical, hand-tied bows. She organized crafting sessions, managed playdates, and maintained a home that always looked ready to be photographed. And she did it all while projecting an aura of boundless, joyful energy. She didn't complain about the exhaustion of raising 2 young children. She leaned into it. She wore her identity as a wife and mother like a badge of absolute honor, and she made sure everyone around her could see it shining. For her husband, Keith Papini, this was the central truth of his universe. Keith and Sherri were not just married, they were a local love story. They had met years earlier, their romance blooming with the kind of Midwestern-style earnestness that feels increasingly rare. Keith worked at Best Buy, providing a steady, reliable income that allowed Sherri to focus her immense energy entirely on their home and their children. He looked at his wife with a kind of quiet, absolute reverence. In his eyes, she was the anchor of their family. She was the light in their home. He trusted her implicitly, not just with his heart, but with the very reality of their shared life. Every marriage has its own private architecture, and theirs was no exception. By the couple's own later accounts, Keith managed the finances closely, and the household ran on a structure of frequent check-ins and close attention to where his wife was and who she was talking to. To the outside world, that looked like devotion. Behind closed doors, it functioned as a kind of quiet surveillance, one Sherri would later describe as suffocating. Whatever the internal reality of that arrangement was, the external performance never wavered. The couple appeared, to everyone in Reading, to be exactly what a marriage was supposed to look like. When you look at the digital footprint she left behind during those years, you don't see a woman struggling with the ordinary, messy chaos of early motherhood. You see a vision board. Her online presence was a carefully managed portfolio of traditional values, wholesome activities, and relentless positivity. She used apps like Poshmark not just to sell clothes, but to project an image of a stylish, organized, thrifty modern woman. Her Pinterest boards were filled with idealized versions of family life. Losing her job at AT&T only sharpened this instinct. Where a full-time career might have once absorbed a portion of her days, she now had hours to fill, and she filled them with curation. The listings on Poshmark multiplied. The craft projects grew more elaborate. Friends who watched her transition from working mother to full-time homemaker didn't see a woman adrift after a layoff. They saw a woman who had finally found her true calling, blooming into the role she was always meant to play. That reading of events wasn't wrong, exactly. It just wasn't complete. What looked like blossoming was also, in part, compensating. This is the crucial thing to understand about the mask she wore. It was not a disguise she put on in the morning and took off when she was alone in the bathroom. The person everyone saw wasn't a lie. It was the only version of herself she could afford to show. The rest didn't exist in any space other people could see. She lived inside this structure. It functioned for her. It drew people toward her. It made her unimpeachable. When you are the woman who bakes the perfect pie and kisses her husband at the door every evening, you become immune to a certain kind of scrutiny. People don't look for cracks in a stained glass window. They just admire the way it catches the light. By the fall of 2016, that window had been intact for years. No one in Reading had any reason to look for a seam in it. That is precisely what made the mask so effective, and precisely what made the events of that November so unthinkable to everyone who thought they knew her. Part of this carefully constructed routine was her dedication to physical fitness. Sherri was an avid runner. She didn't just jog casually on a treadmill in a garage. She ran outdoors, breathing in the Northern California air, a fixture on the rural roads and paved trails near their home in the Mountain Gate neighborhood. Neighbors were entirely accustomed to seeing her petite frame moving steadily along Sunrise Drive. It was a familiar, comforting rhythm. So familiar that when she failed to return home from that route, the entire fabric of the neighborhood's sense of safety would tear in an instant. The dedicated mother, taking a brief moment for herself, maintaining her health so she could be strong for her family. Her running wasn't just exercise. It was a vital component of the Supermom narrative, the proof of her discipline, her vitality, her unwavering commitment to being the best version of herself. There is a particular kind of loneliness that can live inside a marriage built on this much performance. And by most accounts, that loneliness had been growing in Sherri for some time. She would later describe her marriage as tightly controlled, describe herself as a woman quietly starved for a version of connection her home life wasn't giving her. Whatever the full truth of that internal experience was, it existed alongside, not instead of, the meticulous construction of the Supermom persona. She could feel confined by her marriage and still choose, every single day, to present that marriage to the world as flawless. Those two things were not intention for her. They were the same coping mechanism, pointed in two different directions. November 2nd, 2016, began exactly like every other day in the Papini household. It was a Wednesday. The autumn air was crisp, the sky a pale, clear blue. The routine unfolded with the mechanical precision that defined their lives. Keith got up, got dressed, and headed to his job at Best Buy. The two children were dropped off at a local daycare. Sherri had the day to herself. To the outside observer, there was absolutely nothing remarkable about this morning. It was a blank canvas of domestic tranquility. Sherri spent part of the morning at home. A half-wrapped present sat on a table, a silent testament to a task interrupted, or perhaps perfectly paused. She sent a text message to Keith at 10:37 a.m., asking if he was coming home for lunch. It was an ordinary question, the kind of mundane digital check-in that happens millions of times a day between married couples. Keith didn't see the message until 1:39 p.m. He replied that he wouldn't be able to make it back to the house. Sherri never responded. When Keith returned to their Mountain Gate home later that afternoon, the quiet was the first thing that struck him. The house was empty. This, in itself, wasn't entirely unusual. Sherri could have been running an errand, but the time was slipping past 5 p.m. She was supposed to have picked up their two children from daycare. Keith checked the house. Nothing was out of place. The perfectly maintained illusion of their home was completely undisturbed. He called the daycare. The staff informed him that Sherri had never arrived. The children were still there, waiting. For a man who lived his life anchored to the reliability of his wife, this was an impossibility. Sherri did not forget her children. The supermom did not simply lose track of time. Panic is rarely sudden. It usually begins as a cold, creeping sensation of wrongness. Keith pulled out his phone and opened the Find My iPhone app to track Sherri's location. The digital beacon pinged about a mile from their house, near the intersection of Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail. Keith drove to the location immediately. He didn't find his wife. He found the physical remnants of the narrative she was beginning to build. There, in the dirt and dry grass just off the rural road, he found her cell phone. Next to it, her earbuds, neatly resting on the ground. Wound into the wires of the earbuds were several distinct, long strands of her signature blonde hair. It looked exactly like the aftermath of a violent struggle. It looked exactly like a woman had been violently snatched from her life, leaving behind only the most heartbreaking, intimate clues. When the Shasta County Sheriff's Office received the frantic 911 call from Keith, they didn't treat it as a routine missing persons case. They couldn't. The optics were too terrifying. A beautiful young white mother of two, snatched in broad daylight from a quiet suburban jogging trail. It was the quintessential true crime nightmare, manifesting in their own backyard. The community response was immediate and overwhelming. This is the power of the mask Sherri had spent years building. When she vanished, the entire city of Redding mobilized not just for a missing woman, but for an icon of their community. She was their sister, their neighbor, the idealized mother they all recognized. Within hours, search parties were organized. Helicopters chopped through the night sky, their searchlights sweeping over the dense pine forests and rocky ravines. Volunteers printed thousands of flyers, taping her smiling, perfectly curated face to every telephone pole, storefront window, and community bulletin board in the county. Yellow ribbons were tied tightly around the trunks of old oak trees, a desperate plea for her safe return. Keith went on national television, his voice thick with genuine, unimaginable grief. He pleaded with the phantom abductors. He spoke directly into the cameras, begging for the mother of his children to be returned. The nation watched him weep. The nation wept with him. The story exploded across the country. It dominated the 24-hour news cycle. It was the absolute embodiment of missing white woman syndrome, a media phenomenon where the disappearance of an attractive, middle-class white woman generates a disproportionate, massive wave of public interest and sympathy. And Sherri was the perfect protagonist for this tragedy. She had no known enemies. She had no criminal record. She had a loving husband and two beautiful children. She was a runner, a crafter, a homemaker. She was innocent. For 22 days, the town of Redding lived in a state of suspended terror. If Sherri Papini could be taken in broad daylight, no one was safe. Women stopped running alone. Families double-locked their doors. The community grieved the theft of their safety, unified by their profound empathy for the woman who had been stolen from them. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see: a tragedy, a violent interruption of a perfect life. They didn't see the quiet, deliberate mechanics of a performance. Because while hundreds of volunteers were scouring the freezing, dark woods of Shasta County, tearing through brush and crying out her name, Sherri Papini was not lost in the wilderness. She was not fighting for her life in the back of a dark SUV. She was exactly where she had planned to be. Before the abduction, before the frantic 911 call, before the nation learned her name, there was a quiet reality operating beneath the surface of the Papini household. A reality that Keith never saw, and that the community could never have imagined. The public looked at a devoted mother whose entire universe revolved around her two toddlers. But on the morning of November 2nd, before she vanished into thin air, Sherri made sure to drop her children off at daycare, clearing the house, clearing her schedule, and ensuring she had exactly the right amount of uninterrupted time to walk away from her own life. We have a cultural obsession with the idea of the breaking point. When someone commits an act that defies all logic and human empathy, we search desperately for the moment they lost their mind. We look for the financial ruin, the sudden trauma, the devastating heartbreak that severed their connection to reality. We want to believe that ordinary people are fundamentally safe, and that only a sudden, violent catalyst can turn them into something dangerous. But there was no snap. People like Sherri Papini do not suddenly lose control of their faculties on a random Wednesday morning. They do not wake up and spontaneously decide to dismantle their entire existence on a whim. The capacity to orchestrate a massive, fraudulent crisis does not materialize out of thin air. It is cultivated. It is practiced. There is a long, private erosion that no one ever thinks to measure, simply because the surface remains so perfectly polished. When Sherri vanished, the community of Reading saw a terrifying tear in the fabric of their safe reality. They saw a devoted mother ripped away from her idyllic life. But for the people who had known her the longest, her parents, her siblings, the figures from her early adulthood, the panic of November 2016 was likely tinged with a very different, much quieter kind of unease. They didn't know where she was, but they knew who she was. To see the fractures in Sherri's meticulously crafted persona, you have to look past the baking blogs and the Poshmark accounts. You have to rewind the clock back more than a decade, long before she became the region's tragic icon, to a time when she was just a young woman living in Shasta County, testing the boundaries of what she could make people believe. In December of 2003, 13 years before the yellow ribbons were tied around the trees in Mountain Gate, the police were dispatched regarding Sherri. But they weren't called to find her. They were called to stop her. The 911 call was placed by her own mother, Loretta Grafe. The details of that dispatch log are brief, but they paint a picture that stands in horrifying contrast to the smiling, effortless mother the world would later come to know. Loretta told the dispatcher that her 21-year-old daughter was actively harming herself. That in itself is a tragedy. But it was the second half of Loretta's statement that revealed the true mechanics of the incident. Sherri was not just harming herself in a desperate cry for psychiatric help. According to her mother, Sherri was inflicting injuries upon her own body and explicitly threatening to blame those injuries on her parents. She was weaponizing her own pain. Try to place yourself in that room. Imagine the profound, paralyzing helplessness of a mother watching her child strike herself, knowing that the blood and the bruises were about to be used as evidence in a fabricated narrative of abuse. It was not a loss of control. It was a hostage negotiation. She was demonstrating with chilling clarity that she was entirely willing to endure physical suffering if it meant she could control the people around her. If you are a victim, you hold absolute power over the narrative. You demand unquestioning support. You silence all criticism. The victim is immune to judgment, and the accused is immediately put on the defensive. Even at 21 years old, Sherri understood the immense social currency of victimhood, and she was already figuring out how to manufacture it, one small fabrication at a time. This was not an isolated, singular bad night. It was part of a broader, sustained pattern of manipulation and boundary testing that exhausted her family. 3 years prior to that incident, in 2000, her father, Richard Grafe, had called the police to report a burglary at his home. The suspect he named wasn't a stranger. It was his daughter, Sherri. Another report from her family during that era claimed she had stolen money from a checking account. In 2003, there was yet another call to law enforcement from her parents, this time regarding her unauthorized use of a credit card. When you look at these police logs in succession, you don't just see a troubled youth. You see someone who felt entirely entitled to cross severe legal and moral lines, specifically against the people who loved her the most. You see a young woman who was already utilizing the authorities, the police, the official record, as tools in her interpersonal conflicts. But families are intricate ecosystems built entirely on preservation. When someone you love exhibits this kind of behavior, you do not immediately label them a dangerous manipulator. You find softer words. You call it a phase. You call it rebellion or youthful chaos or a desperate need for attention. You smooth over the cracks in the foundation because acknowledging them means you might have to tear the whole house down. Her family loved her, and so they absorbed the chaos. They moved past it. This pattern, of a family quietly reorganizing itself around one member's instability rather than confronting it, would repeat itself on a much larger scale in 2016. Just as her parents once chose to absorb the shock of a fabricated burglary accusation rather than sever the relationship, Keith would later choose to absorb 4 years of an elaborate lie rather than accept that the woman he loved was capable of building it. Both responses came from the same place. Both responses made the eventual reckoning that much harder when it finally arrived. And as Sherri moved out of her early 20s and toward her marriage with Keith, the chaotic, combative young woman began to disappear. She was replaced gradually and deliberately by the Supermom. Keith Papini did not see the girl who allegedly kicked in her father's door, or the daughter who threatened to frame her parents for domestic abuse. He met a bright, energetic woman who wanted nothing more than to build a beautiful life with him. But the marriage was not without its own quiet fractures. At some point in their relationship, Keith discovered that Sherri had been forming emotional attachments to other men, conversations and connections she kept hidden from him. In response, the couple signed a post-nuptial agreement, a legal document stipulating that if Sherri were ever caught stepping outside the boundaries of their marriage again, Keith would retain full custody of their children. It is a detail that reveals two things simultaneously. It confirms that Sherri's pattern of maintaining secret, compartmentalized relationships predated her disappearance by years. And it shows that by the time she vanished, she was living under the explicit, formalized threat of losing her children if anyone ever found out. This is where the psychological reality of this case becomes deeply uncomfortable. The mask of the perfect wife wasn't a lie she told Keith to trick him. It was a completely new structure she built to house her endless need for validation. Keith was a quiet, steady man who offered her absolute adoration. He was the perfect audience. With him, she didn't need to manufacture crises to get attention. She simply had to perform the role of the flawless homemaker, and he rewarded her with unwavering devotion. She effectively erased her past. She created a localized reality where she was the undisputed hero of her own story. But the need for profound, overwhelming attention is a hunger that cannot be permanently satisfied by baked goods and PDA meetings. A narcissist's need for validation is a bottomless well. When ordinary life, even a deeply loved, comfortable ordinary life, begins to feel small, the architecture of the mask requires a massive influx of energy to stay intact. To understand how she decided to get that energy, we have to look at the darkest, most specific fracture in her history. A fracture that was completely hidden from the public during the frantic search in 2016. but one that held the exact blueprint of the nightmare she would eventually unleash. In 2003, a long, deeply disturbing post appeared on an obscure, now-defunct website called skinheadsy.com. The post was attributed to Sherri Grafe, Sherri's maiden name. The essay was written in the first person, and it detailed a vivid, violent narrative. The author claimed that she was growing up in Shasta County, trying to defend her father's honor against a group of malicious, drug-addicted individuals. The climax of the story involved the author being physically attacked by a group of Latina women. The post described a brutal, chaotic fight. The author claimed she fought back valiantly against her Hispanic attackers, suffering severe injuries in the process. She described the sickening crack of her own nose being broken. She painted a picture of herself as a bloodied, brave, white martyr standing her ground against a violent, racialized enemy. Years later, when this post resurfaced, Sherri would vehemently deny writing it. She claimed someone else had stolen her name and posted it as a malicious prank. But the fingerprints of her imagination were pressed deeply into every single syllable of that essay. Consider the sheer impossibility of the coincidence. The woman who allegedly wrote an essay in 2003 about being battered by Latina women, suffering a broken nose, and surviving as a heroic victim, is the exact same woman who, 13 years later, would turn up on the side of a highway with a broken nose, claiming she had been battered and abducted by a pair of Hispanic women. She didn't just invent a story in 2016. She dusted off a script she had drafted more than a decade earlier. This post reveals the terrifying core of how her mind operated. She had a profound, underlying fixation on a very specific type of victimhood. She was fascinated by the idea of racialized violence, where she was the pure, innocent target of dark, faceless aggressors. It was a narrative designed to elicit maximum sympathy and outrage from her specific cultural environment. She understood, even in her early 20s, that nothing galvanizes a community quite like the brutalization of an innocent. She knew that a broken nose wasn't just an injury. It was a prop. It was a piece of physical evidence that commanded unquestioning loyalty. When you lay the 2003 essay next to the 2003 police logs of her self-harm, the full, devastating picture begins to develop. The capacity to inflict pain on her own body. The capacity to blame that pain on innocent people. The creation of a racially charged, dramatic narrative of abduction and torture. These weren't isolated incidents. They were rehearsals. She was practicing the mechanics of profound deception. But in 2003, she was an amateur. Her audience was small, her parents the local police, a fringe internet forum. She didn't have the stage, and she didn't have the perfect mask. Consider, too, what it says about the durability of that early script that she never actually discarded it. Most people who write something reckless and dishonest in their early 20s eventually outgrow it, bury it, let it fade into an embarrassing footnote of a younger, less composed self. Sherri didn't outgrow the 2003 post. She upgraded it. The bones of the story stayed identical for 13 years. A white woman, attacked without provocation by Hispanic aggressors, suffering a broken nose as proof of her victimhood. The only things that changed between the version she posted to an obscure forum and the version she told to federal investigators were the production values. She had a bigger budget, a real audience, and 13 more years of practice inhabiting the role of the wounded innocent. By 2016, she had both. She had the devoted husband who would defend her to the death. She had the beautiful children who made her the ultimate sympathetic figure. She had the immaculate home and the spotless reputation in a town that prided itself on looking out for its own. The Supermom persona wasn't just a way to live comfortably. It was the necessary collateral. You cannot orchestrate the crime of the century if nobody cares about you. You have to make yourself indispensable first. You have to make sure that when you disappear, the silence you leave behind is deafening. This casts a sickening new light on the days immediately preceding November 2nd. If you view her life through the lens of a sudden, tragic abduction, the half-wrapped present on the table and the unreturned text message to Keith are heartbreaking artifacts of an interrupted life. They are the symbols of a woman who fully intended to be there for dinner. But if you view them through the lens of her history, through the police logs, the self-harm, the elaborate fictions, those same artifacts become something entirely different. They are no longer innocent remnants. They are set dressing. She didn't leave the present half-wrapped because she was snatched away. She left it half-wrapped because she knew how it would look to the detectives who would inevitably walk through her front door. It was a deliberate, calculated stroke of emotional manipulation, designed to cement the narrative that she had been taken against her will. The unreturned text to Keith wasn't a missed connection. It was the opening bell of the performance. It was the precise moment she chose to initiate his terror. Think about the discipline that required. A woman genuinely overwhelmed by an impulsive decision to walk away from her life does not have the presence of mind to stage a scene. She does not think to leave a present half-wrapped so that detectives will read it as evidence of interruption rather than intent. That level of attention to how her own absence would be interpreted by strangers is not the behavior of someone in crisis. It is the behavior of someone directing a scene from just off-camera, watching to make sure every prop lands exactly where it needs to. And this is the fracture that the Supermom mask was always built to cover. Not a single moment of madness, but a decade-long, well-practiced relationship with her own capacity for deception. One that had already survived a burglary accusation, a stolen credit card, a fabricated hate crime narrative, and a post-nuptial agreement threatening to take her children away. By November of 2016, walking away from her own life wasn't a break from who she was. It was, in a very real sense, the truest expression of it. She knew exactly what Keith would do when she didn't pick up the kids. She knew he would track her phone. She knew he would drive to that rural intersection. She meticulously placed her cell phone in the dirt. She carefully laid out her earbuds. And then, in a stroke of chilling theatrical genius, she deliberately pulled strands of her own blonde hair from her head and wove them into the wires. Every one of those choices required her to think several steps ahead, to anticipate not just what Keith would do, but what a sheriff's deputy would conclude, and what a national news audience would feel when the photographs of that scene were eventually released. That is not the panic of a woman fleeing a marriage in the heat of the moment. That is the composure of someone who had already staged the scene in her mind long before she ever walked out to the intersection to build it in real life. She was leaving breadcrumbs for a man she knew would follow them to the ends of the earth. She was weaponizing his love for her, turning his genuine devotion into the engine that would drive her massive national spectacle. She didn't snap. She didn't lose her mind. She carefully packed a bag, set her stage, and walked out of her own life with the cold, deliberate precision of a director calling action. Every fracture we've traced, the self-harm, the false accusations, the fabricated hate crime essay, the post-nuptial threat hanging over her marriage, had been quietly preparing her for exactly this moment. The public looked at the abandoned phone and the blonde hair tangled in the dirt, and they saw a mother who had been dragged screaming into the darkness. But what no one knew, what the thousands of volunteers searching the woods could never have comprehended, was that while they were freezing in the California autumn, desperately hunting for her captors, Sherri Papini was safely sitting in a living room hundreds of miles away, watching them look for her on the evening news. When we think of someone leading a double life, we usually imagine a second, fully realized existence. A secret family in another town, a hidden career, a separate, vibrant social circle operating just out of frame. It implies a person who wants more out of life, someone who has built an entirely new world to inhabit when their primary reality becomes too stifling. But Sherri Papini's double life was not about building something new. It was a demolition project, aimed directly at the foundation of her own home. She did not want a second life. She wanted to destroy the one she had, strictly so she could stand in the wreckage and force everyone to watch her survive it. There is an important distinction hiding in that sentence. A person building a genuine second life wants an escape hatch, a door left quietly open in case the first life becomes unbearable. Sherri wanted the opposite. She wanted the first life to remain completely intact, waiting for her untouched, so that she could return to it wearing the costume of a survivor and receive a hero's welcome for having endured a catastrophe that only she knew was fictional. The double life wasn't a parallel existence running alongside her marriage. It was a controlled demolition scheduled with a precise date for reconstruction. To execute a disappearing act of this magnitude, you cannot simply walk out the front door. You need logistics. You need a destination. Most importantly, if you are attempting to construct a narrative of victimhood, you need someone willing to play the savior. Sherri could not hire a professional to help her vanish, nor could she enlist a friend from Reading. Anyone tethered to her daily life was a liability. She needed someone entirely disconnected from the Shasta County ecosystem, someone isolated, malleable, and harboring a lingering affection that could be easily manipulated. She found the perfect instrument in James Reyes. James was an ex-boyfriend from her youth. They had dated briefly more than a decade earlier, before Keith, before the children, before the Supermom persona had fully calcified. He now lived a quiet, solitary life in Costa Mesa, California, a suburban sprawl in Orange County, more than 500 miles south of Reading. He was a man living in the margins of his own life, lacking deep community ties or a demanding daily routine. He was, in every psychological sense, the ideal mark. But James was not the only secret Sherri was keeping in the months before she vanished. Investigators would later uncover that she had also been in contact with a man in Detroit, someone she had reconnected with years after a brief relationship in 2011. The texts and calls between them continued into the weeks leading up to her disappearance, and for a brief period, detectives seriously considered whether he might be connected to whatever had happened to her. He was eventually cleared. Records placed him in California, nowhere near Reading, on the day she vanished, and he told investigators the two of them had never actually reunited in person. The detail matters less for what it proves about that specific man than for what it proves about Sherri. This was not a woman who kept one carefully managed secret. It was a woman running multiple parallel threads of hidden connections simultaneously, each one compartmentalized from the others. Each one a small rehearsal in maintaining a version of herself that no single person in her life ever saw in full. The burner phone wasn't purchased for James alone. It was purchased for a life that existed entirely underneath the one Keith believed he was living inside. Nearly a year before she disappeared, while actively curating her perfect domestic image online and baking for her children, Sherri purchased a prepaid burner phone. This detail alone fundamentally rewrites the narrative of a spontaneous crisis. The purchase of a second, untraceable phone is the absolute demarcation line between fantasy and premeditation. You do not buy a burner phone unless you intend to deceive the people who pay the bill for your primary one. For months, Sherri used this hidden device to quietly reach out into the past. She began texting James. The messages were not casual catch-ups. She did not ask about his life in Southern California or reminisce about their shared youth. Instead, she immediately began laying the emotional groundwork for her grand production. She started feeding him a carefully constructed fiction, portraying herself as a desperate, terrified woman trapped in a nightmare. She told James that Keith was physically abusive. She claimed she was being beaten, controlled, and emotionally terrorized. She told him that she had reached out to the local police in Redding, but that law enforcement was entirely corrupt, ignoring her pleas and leaving her to suffer in silence. None of this was true. There was never a single report of domestic violence in the Papini household. Keith was by all accounts a gentle, devoted husband who worshipped his wife. But James didn't know Keith. He only knew the woman texting him from a secret phone, claiming her life was in imminent danger. This is the terrifying genius of her manipulation. She weaponized the language of genuine domestic abuse survivors to forge a key that would unlock James's absolute compliance. She didn't ask him to help her perpetrate a massive federal fraud. She asked him to rescue her. She gave him the opportunity to be the white knight for a woman he used to love. By playing the ultimate, helpless victim long before she actually vanished, she guaranteed that when she finally asked for extraction, he would not hesitate. It is worth pausing on what this reveals about her method more broadly. Sherri did not simply lie to people when she needed something from them. She built entire emotional infrastructures months in advance, laid one careful brick of false context at a time, until the person on the other end of the conversation was operating from a completely fabricated understanding of reality without ever realizing it had happened gradually. James wasn't tricked in a single conversation. He was cultivated over months, the way a con artist cultivates a mark, except the currency she was trading in wasn't money. It was his memory of who she used to be to him, and his belief that he was finally being given the chance to matter to her again. In late October, the secret messages escalated into concrete logistics. The plan was finalized. On the morning of November 2nd, after dropping her children at daycare and sending that mundane decoy text message to Keith about lunch, Sherri walked to the rural intersection of Sunrise Drive and Old Oregon Trail. She meticulously placed her primary cell phone in the dirt. She carefully arranged her earbuds. She wove her own blonde hair into the wires to simulate a violent struggle. And then she waited. She did not wait long. Pulling up to the intersection was a dark-colored rental SUV. Behind the wheel was James Reyes. He had driven over 8 hours through the night from Costa Mesa, explicitly following her instructions to come and save her from a life that wasn't actually threatening her. Sherri got into the passenger seat. She did not look back. Consider the profound psychological dissonance of the next 8 hours. As the dark SUV merged onto Interstate 5, heading south through the sprawling agricultural fields of the Central Valley, the machinery of panic was just beginning to grind to life back in Redding. The daycare was realizing she was late. Keith was staring at a silent phone, a cold knot of dread forming in his stomach. The first 911 call was hours away from being placed. Inside the vehicle, there was no panic. There were no guns, no zip ties, no screaming. There was just a quiet drive. They stopped for fast food. They listened to the radio. Sherri sat comfortably in the passenger seat, watching the California landscape blur past her window, actively choosing, mile after mile, not to turn back. By the time they arrived at James's apartment in Costa Mesa, the sun had set. Keith was standing in the dark on a dirt road, holding his wife's abandoned cell phone, his entire reality shattering around him. James's apartment was modest. A standard, unremarkable living space in a Southern California complex. It was not a dungeon. There were no padlocks on the doors, no boarded-up windows, no basement cells. When Sherri walked through the front door, she entered the most surreal phase of her entire deception. For the next 22 days, she simply lived there. She was not a prisoner in that apartment, and the people around James knew it. A cousin of his would later tell investigators that he had seen Sherri inside the apartment on 2 separate occasions during those 3 weeks. Both times she was unrestrained. No chains, no hose clamps, no dark room with a bag over her head. Just a woman sitting in an ordinary Southern California living room. 3 weeks before she would be found on the side of a freeway insisting she had never once been free to leave. But walking away from Redding was only the prologue. The quiet safety of a Costa Mesa apartment was never the final goal. It was merely the studio she required. Everything up to this point, the burner phones, the manipulated ex-boyfriend, the fabricated struggle in the dirt, that was just rehearsal. The real performance was about to begin, and the canvas she chose to work on was her own flesh. To sell the story of a brutal, racially motivated abduction by 2 violent Hispanic women, Sherri knew that her word alone would not be enough. The public and law enforcement require physical proof of trauma to validate a victim. She could not return home looking like a woman who had spent 3 weeks relaxing in an Orange County apartment. She had to return looking like a woman who had barely survived a descent into hell. And so, within the 4 walls of that quiet apartment, while James went to work and ran errands, Sherri Papini initiated a systematic, agonizing campaign of self-destruction. The first and perhaps most difficult element to manufacture was the extreme weight loss. When she was eventually found on Thanksgiving morning, she weighed just 87 pounds. That kind of physical deterioration does not happen by accident. It requires a sustained, brutal discipline. For 3 straight weeks, she deliberately starved herself. Hunger is one of the most powerful, overriding biological imperatives the human body possesses. To deny it day after day requires an immense expenditure of psychological energy. Every time her stomach cramped, every time she felt faint or dizzy from caloric deficit, she had to make the conscious choice to continue fasting. She was surrounded by a fully stocked kitchen. James was bringing food into the apartment. She simply refused to eat it. She was weaponizing her own biology. She endured the visceral, exhausting pain of starvation not because she was physically restrained from eating, but because she viewed the gauntness of her own face and the protrusion of her own ribs as necessary props for her upcoming stage debut. The physical suffering was completely functional. It bought her the narrative. But starvation alone wasn't enough. A kidnapping victim who has been held captive by sadists for 3 weeks must bear the physical marks of violence. The bruises were next. According to the later federal investigation, Sherri did not inflict all of the blunt force trauma upon herself. She convinced James to assist her. This requires a level of psychological manipulation that borders on the unfathomable. Imagine looking at someone who has driven 500 miles to rescue you and instructing them to physically batter you. They used sporting equipment. A hockey stick became the instrument of her simulated torture. She instructed James to strike her. She absorbed the blows. She allowed the heavy wood and composite materials to collide with her arms, her legs, her torso. She needed the deep, purple contusions that only blunt force trauma can create. When it came time to simulate a broken nose, she reportedly threw herself against the hard surfaces of the bathroom. The sickening crack of bone and cartilage, the immediate swelling, the blood, she welcomed all of it. She wanted the bridge of her nose to be visibly deformed. She remembered the script she had written back in 2003 on that obscure internet forum. The brave, battered victim with a shattered face. She was finally bringing her own fan fiction to life, using her body as the ultimate special effect. Then came the hair. Sherri's long, carefully maintained blonde hair was a cornerstone of her Supermom aesthetic. It was a symbol of her femininity, her health, and her carefully curated normalcy. In the visual language of trauma, forcibly cutting a woman's hair is an act of deep degradation. It signifies a loss of identity and absolute control by the captors. She needed to look degraded. Inside the apartment, the golden hair was roughly, unevenly chopped off. It wasn't a clean cut. It was jagged, designed to look as though it had been done in the dark by someone acting with malice and haste. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw her own creation staring back at her. A gaunt, bruised, battered, shorn stranger. To an ordinary human mind, this reflection would induce profound panic. To Sherri, it was likely deeply validating. She was successfully molding herself into the exact shape of a national tragedy. But the most extreme, terrifying act of self-mutilation was still to come. A bruised face eventually heals. Cut hair eventually grows back. Sherri needed something permanent, something that would evoke a visceral, sickening reaction from the public and permanently sear the reality of her torture into the minds of the detectives. She decided to brand herself. Branding is a practice reserved for livestock. It is the ultimate symbol of ownership, dehumanization, and inescapable control. By placing a brand on her own body, she was forging the absolute, undeniable proof of her victimhood. It was the masterstroke of her horrific theater. She and James obtained a wood-burning tool. This is a device designed for crafting, featuring a metal tip that heats to hundreds of degrees, capable of scorching patterns deep into solid oak. Sherri heated the metal. She pulled down the fabric of her shirt, exposing her right shoulder. And then, she pressed the searing iron into her own flesh. The smell of burning skin. The blinding, searing pain of third-degree burns. The permanent destruction of tissue. She endured all of it completely voluntarily in a quiet suburban apartment. The brand was an obscure message, a series of distorted letters or symbols that she would later claim was a message from her captors, a way to mark her for human trafficking. It was absolute nonsense, but it was permanent nonsense. It was a scar she was willing to carry for the rest of her natural life, solely to ensure that no one would ever dare question her story. Consider the layers of premeditation required for that single act. She had to select a word or symbol in advance. She had to decide where on her body it would be most visible to a medical examiner, and most consistent with a captor's desire to mark their property, without being so prominent that it would have been noticed by her own family in the weeks before she vanished. She had to choose an image durable enough to survive scarring, ambiguous enough to defy easy translation, and permanent enough that no future recantation could ever fully erase it from her skin. That is not the decision-making process of a woman in the grip of psychosis. It is the decision-making process of a person building evidence. While she was meticulously destroying her body, the world outside James's apartment was tearing itself apart trying to find her. This is the darkest, most unfathomable aspect of the 22 days she spent in Costa Mesa. She was not isolated from the consequences of her actions. She had a television. She had access to the internet. She could turn on the evening news and watch her husband weeping on national television. She could see Keith, his face hollowed out by grief and exhaustion, begging phantom kidnappers to let the mother of his children go. She could see the footage of the yellow ribbons tied around the trees in Mountain Gate. She could see the exhausted volunteers returning from the cold, dark woods, having spent hours searching ravines for her corpse. She knew with absolute certainty that her 2 toddlers were crying for their mother. She knew that Keith was living in a state of unimaginable psychological torture, entirely convinced that his wife was being raped, beaten, or murdered. And every single day, she woke up, looked at the television, and made the active, conscious decision not to end his suffering. She possessed the power at any moment to pick up a phone and end the nightmare. A single phone call would have stopped the search, dried her husband's tears, and returned a mother to her children. She refused to make it. To maintain that level of silence requires a profound, structural lack of empathy. It requires a mind that views other human beings not as people with their own internal emotional lives, but as props on a stage. Keith's grief was not a tragedy to her. It was a metric of her success. The louder he cried, the more the community panicked, the more valuable her eventual return would be. She was soaking in the terrified attention of an entire country, and she found it more nourishing than the food she was refusing to eat. As November dragged on, the 3-week mark approached. The physical transformation was complete. She was starved, beaten, shorn, and permanently branded. The narrative of her torture was physically written across every inch of her body. But staying hidden forever was never the objective. The entire point of a resurrection is the audience. The entire point of the mask is having someone to wear it for. She needed to time her return perfectly. She needed a moment that would maximize the emotional impact of her survival. A moment that would overwhelm any potential skepticism with a tidal wave of public relief. She looked at the calendar. Thanksgiving was approaching. It was the most emotionally resonant holiday of the American year. A day dedicated to family, gratitude, and coming home. To emerge on Thanksgiving morning wouldn't just be a survival story, it would be a modern miracle. It would be an event that local pastors would preach about and news anchors would cry over. She told James it was time to go home. The extraction required as much theatrical preparation as the abduction. She couldn't simply have James drive her up to her front door and drop her off. She had to be found. She had to be discovered in the wild, looking like a piece of refuse discarded by panicked captors. She gathered her props. She acquired heavy metal chains. She secured hose clamps, the kind used in automotive repair, strong enough to bite into the skin and require tools to remove. She needed to be bound so tightly that the first responders would have to struggle to free her. She bound the chains around her waist. She secured her wrists. On the evening of November 23rd, the night before Thanksgiving, James Reyes loaded the broken, starved, chained woman back into his vehicle. The drive north was a mirror image of the drive south, but the stakes had entirely shifted. When they drove down I-5 3 weeks earlier, she was a healthy woman fleeing a fictional abuser. Now, as they drove back up the dark interstate toward Northern California, she was a masterpiece of manufactured trauma, preparing to unleash her final act on a community that had bled itself dry trying to find her. Somewhere on that drive north, James Reyes must have understood, at least in part, what he had actually participated in. He was not delivering a woman he loved back to safety. He was delivering a prop back to its stage, dressed and damaged exactly according to specification. Whatever affection had once existed between them, whatever residual loyalty had convinced him to strike her with a hockey stick and hand her a wood-burning tool, none of it changed what waited for him on the other end of this. He was about to become the walking, breathing loose thread in a story engineered to have no loose threads. The public would soon be told that her captors, panicked by the intense media coverage, had violently shoved her out of an SUV on the side of a freezing highway. But the truth was far quieter, and infinitely more disturbing. She wasn't discarded. She was carefully placed on her mark, waiting for the curtain to rise. Interstate 5, near the town of Woodland in Yolo County, is a desolate stretch of asphalt in the hours before dawn. On Thanksgiving morning, November 24, 2016, the air was bitter and biting. The temperature hovered near freezing. It is the kind of quiet that feels heavy, broken only by the occasional roar of a long-haul truck tearing through the darkness. At approximately 4:30 a.m., a motorist traveling northbound saw something moving in the gloom near the County Road 17 off-ramp. It was a figure, small, erratic, waving a piece of light-colored fabric. When the California Highway Patrol and local sheriff's deputies arrived at the desolate interchange, the scene illuminated by the harsh, sweeping glow of their headlights defied all immediate comprehension. The officers stepped out of their cruisers and found the ghost of Shasta County. Sherri Papini was standing in the freezing dirt. She was a physical manifestation of a horror movie, meticulously constructed for maximum psychological impact. Around her waist hung a heavy length of metal chain, the kind you might use to secure a gate. It was fastened tightly. Her wrists were bound. To ensure the restraints looked both improvised and inescapable, they were secured with metal hose clamps. These are industrial fasteners, tightened with a screw mechanism, designed to bite down hard and permanently hold pressurized pipes together. They dug viciously into her skin. She was violently shaking from the cold. Her face was battered, dominated by the deep, dark swelling of a shattered nose. The signature blonde hair that had adorned thousands of missing person flyers was gone, hacked away in jagged, uneven layers that barely brushed her chin. She weighed exactly 87 pounds. When the officers approached her, she did not just look like a victim. She performed the role with absolute, terrifying conviction. She spat blood. She screamed. She told the deputies that she had been shoved out of the side of a dark SUV. She was frantic, disoriented, the perfect picture of a woman who had just been released from hell and still couldn't quite believe the sky was above her. First responders are trained to manage trauma, to bring order to chaos. But the sheer visual weight of her condition was overwhelming. They had to use bolt cutters to sever the heavy chains. They had to use specialized tools to carefully unscrew the hose clamps biting into her wrists. Every physical barrier they removed reinforced the unquestionable reality of her suffering. Within minutes, the radio dispatch cracked through the Northern California night. The impossible had happened. Sherri Papini was alive. When Keith Papini received the phone call that his wife had been found, the reaction was not simple relief. It was the catastrophic release of 3 weeks of unrelenting, paralyzing terror. He was driven the roughly 140 miles south to the hospital in Woodland, a journey that must have felt entirely untethered from time. The hospital room where they were reunited is the emotional epicenter of this entire fabrication. Keith walked into that sterile, brightly lit room expecting to see the woman who had left their home 22 days earlier. The Supermom, the vibrant, athletic center of his universe. Instead, he found a broken bird. He saw the bruises coloring her face in violent shades of yellow and purple. He saw the emaciated frame, her collarbones protruding sharply beneath the thin hospital gown. He saw the hacked hair. He saw the raw, red welts where the hose clamps had torn into her wrists. And then she showed him the brand. On her right shoulder, scorched deep into the tissue, was the physical proof of her dehumanization. It was a burn so severe it had permanently altered the texture of her skin. He fell to his knees. He wept over her battered body. He touched the jagged ends of her hair. He absorbed the absolute totality of the violence she had allegedly endured. This is the moment the psychological framework of her deception becomes almost unbearable to examine. Sherri lay in that hospital bed, watching her husband break down in agony over the injuries she had inflicted upon herself. She felt him holding her hand. She heard his voice thick with tears. She watched him process the trauma of the brand, the starvation, the chains. She didn't flinch. She didn't break. She didn't snap under the weight of guilt. She simply absorbed his grief as validation. His tears were the final seal of approval on her masterpiece. She was finally the center of the universe, and the currency she used to buy that position was his profound, unimaginable pain. The mechanism here is critical to understand. The mask was not slipping. It was fusing to her skin. The person who baked the pies and curated the perfect Pinterest boards was the exact same person who quietly orchestrated this hospital room reunion. The Supermom persona required an audience to function, and the ultimate survivor persona simply required a larger one. She was the hero of the narrative, surviving against impossible odds, returning to the husband who loved her enough to search the world for her. As the medical staff tended to her self-inflicted wounds, the detectives arrived. The Shasta County Sheriff's Office, the FBI, and local authorities needed to know exactly what had happened in the dark for the last 3 weeks. They needed a description. They needed suspects. They needed to know who had done this to the woman they had spent millions of dollars trying to find. Sherri was ready. She had spent 3 weeks rehearsing. Her interviews with law enforcement were masterclasses in calculated ambiguity. She didn't offer a clean, perfect story. That would have looked suspicious. A real victim of severe trauma is fragmented, confused, and overwhelmed by sensory memories. Sherri understood this. She performed the symptoms of PTSD flawlessly. She wept. She buried her face in her hands. She hyperventilated when they asked specific questions. She spoke in fractured, terrifying bursts of detail. She told them about the 2 Hispanic women. She described them with specific, carefully chosen attributes designed to lock them in the minds of the investigators. There was a younger woman with long curly hair, thick eyebrows, and a heavy accent. There was an older woman, straight black hair with graying roots, thick eyebrows. She told the FBI agents that they spoke entirely in Spanish. She described being held in a dark room. She described a bucket filled with kitty litter that she was forced to use as a toilet. She claimed they kept a dark bag over her head for nearly the entire 22 days. She said her captors constantly blasted extremely loud Mexican music to drown out any noise and keep her disoriented. Listen to the specific details she chose to invent. Loud Mexican music. Spanish-speaking women with thick eyebrows. The dark SUV. She was deliberately weaponizing the darkest, most pervasive cultural anxieties of her region. Northern California has deeply entrenched political and social tensions regarding border security, cartel violence, and human trafficking. Sherri wasn't just inventing a story. She was feeding the authorities a narrative they were already biologically primed to believe. She gave them the exact monsters they were already looking for. She claimed that the older woman had been the one to hack off her hair, laughing as she did it. She claimed they had slammed her face repeatedly into the hard fixtures of the room, breaking her nose. She said they starved her intentionally, mocking her as she withered away. When the detectives asked about the brand on her shoulder, her story became even more insidious. She claimed it was a message, a mark to sell her into the sex trade. The detectives listened. They took notes. They treated her with the profound gentleness reserved for the most fragile survivors of human depravity. They had no reason to doubt her. The physical evidence was strapped to her body. The chains, the brand, the 87-pound frame. You cannot fake a broken nose when the X-rays show the fracture. You cannot fake third-degree burns. Because the human brain is fundamentally wired to believe that no sane person would ever inflict that level of permanent damage on themselves, the police had no choice but to believe the phantom women existed. By the time the sun fully rose on Thanksgiving Day, the news had broken across the country. The media frenzy was absolute. The yellow ribbons in Mountain Gate were suddenly symbols of victory. News anchors on national television choked back tears as they announced the miracle. Families sitting down to their holiday dinners raised glasses to Sherri Papini. The collective relief was intoxicating. It validated everything the true crime-consuming public wants to believe about the world. It proved that sometimes the monster doesn't win. Sometimes the beautiful mother survives the dungeon and makes it back to her children. It was a modern-day fairy tale forged in the fires of unimaginable trauma. But the reality on the ground in Reading was fundamentally altered. Because Sherri had introduced two violent, heavily armed Hispanic women into the narrative, the community was no longer just relieved. They were terrified. The sheriff's office was forced to issue warnings to the public. They released composite sketches based on Sherri's detailed, fabricated descriptions. These sketches were broadcast on every news channel, printed in every newspaper, and shared millions of times across social media. The sketches depicted two stern-looking Latina women, faceless phantoms that Sherri had willed into existence. The consequences of this specific lie were immediate and dangerous. Hispanic women in Northern California suddenly found themselves under the paranoid, scrutinizing gaze of a terrified community. Tips flooded into the police station. Citizens called 911 because they saw a dark SUV at a gas station, or because a woman with thick eyebrows looked at them strangely in a grocery store aisle. Sherri Papini didn't just lie about where she was. She actively endangered an entire demographic of people to make her lie look real. She weaponized the police force. She turned every neighbor into a vigilante. She created a localized panic that rippled through the Central Valley, all while she sat safely in her bed, recovering from the wounds she had asked James Reyes to inflict. Keith, completely consumed by his role as the protective husband, released a massive, emotional statement to the press. He didn't just thank the community. He went on the offensive against the early internet rumors that had dared to suggest his wife's disappearance might be a hoax. He described in visceral, heartbreaking detail the condition of his wife's body. He talked about her weighing 87 pounds. He talked about the bruises ranging from yellow to black. He talked about her severe burns, her broken nose, and her chopped hair. He aimed his anger directly at the skeptics, calling their theories exhausting and disgusting. He wrote with the absolute, blind fury of a man defending a martyr. He wrote, "We are a very strong family and will not let the perpetrators win." He didn't know that the perpetrator was sleeping next to him. The collapse of Sherri Papini's life did not happen when she disappeared. It happened when she returned. When you orchestrate a lie of this magnitude, you do not get to walk away when the curtain falls. The machinery of a federal investigation does not simply pack up and leave because the victim is home. The FBI and the Shasta County Sheriff's Office had a double kidnapping and torture case to solve. They had a violent cartel or human trafficking ring operating in their jurisdiction. They had a mandate to find the dark SUV and the two women before they snatched another mother off the street. They dedicated massive resources to the hunt. They pulled surveillance footage from every camera along Interstate 5. They analyzed the cell phone data from the exact spot she vanished. They sent the clothing she was wearing on Thanksgiving morning to the California Department of Justice DNA laboratory. The scale of that hunt is easy to understate in hindsight. now that we know none of it was ever necessary. Detectives eventually authored close to 20 separate search warrants, reaching well beyond California's borders and into states as far away as Michigan, chasing down cell records, bank statements, email accounts, and social media activity. A GoFundMe campaign set up to support the family raised more than $49,000 from strangers who had never met Sherri Papini, but felt compelled to help a mother they believed was fighting for her life. None of that money, none of those subpoenas, none of those investigative hours were spent looking for two Hispanic women in a dark SUV. They were spent, unknowingly, documenting the movements of a woman who was never missing at all. They processed the heavy chains. They swabbed the metal hose clamps. Sherri had meticulously planned the visual impact of her return. She had mastered the physical performance of a traumatized victim. She had successfully manipulated her husband, the media, and the initial wave of first responders. But a performance designed for a camera cannot withstand the microscopic scrutiny of a forensics lab. She understood the psychology of deception, but she fundamentally underestimated the cold, absolute permanence of biology. She believed she had wiped the slate clean. She believed the brand on her shoulder would be the only physical evidence that mattered. But as she settled back into her home, playing the quiet, terrified survivor for Keith and her children, the evidence she left behind was already beginning to process. The clothing she wore when she was found, the sweatpants, the shirt, held a secret she couldn't burn away. The DNA lab extracted a profile. It did not belong to a Hispanic woman. It belonged to a male. And as the investigators began to slowly peel back the layers of her meticulously constructed timeline, they didn't find the footprint of a violent cartel. They found the burner phones. They found the missing hours. The grand, terrifying narrative of the two women in the dark SUV began to fray, not from a sudden tear, but from 1,000 microscopic inconsistencies. Sherri Papini had successfully forced the entire world to look at her. But she failed to realize that when you demand the absolute attention of the federal government, they do not stop looking when the show is over. They look closer. And they were about to see the exact structure of the mask she had spent her entire adult life building. There is a particular kind of arrogance required to believe that a performance convincing enough to fool an entire county, an FBI sketch artist, and a husband who adored you would also be convincing enough to fool a forensics lab. Sherri had spent 3 weeks perfecting the visual language of trauma. She had not spent a single moment considering that the male DNA on her sweatpants didn't need to convince anyone of anything. It simply needed to exist, sitting quietly in an evidence locker, waiting for the technology to catch up to it. For nearly 4 years, the ghost story was the official record. From November 2016 until the spring of 2020, Sherri Papini lived quietly inside the very tragedy she had authored. The nation had eventually moved on, as it always does when the news cycle demands a new victim. But in Shasta County, the aftershocks remained entirely real. Women in the community still looked over their shoulders when a dark SUV idled at a crosswalk. The composite sketches of the two Latina women, the phantoms with the thick eyebrows and the cruel intentions, remained burned into the local consciousness. They were the boogeymen of Northern California, and Sherri was the surviving saint. To understand the absolute rigidity of her mask, you have to look at how she spent those silent years. She did not quietly retreat in shame. She leaned into the structure of her victimhood with the same meticulous dedication she once applied to her baking blogs. She attended therapy to process the trauma of an abduction that never occurred. She allowed mental health professionals to sit across from her and gently guide her through the imaginary horrors of that dark room. She accepted over $30,000 from the California Victim Compensation Board, taxpayer money designed to help people who have survived genuine, unimaginable violence. And she used it to pay her credit card bills and cover the costs of her home window blinds. But the Victim Compensation Board was only one line item in a much larger pattern. Investigators would later determine that Sherri had also been collecting Social Security disability payments during this same period, filing claims rooted in the same fabricated trauma she had described to the FBI. Every system built to catch and support people who have genuinely suffered became, for her, another revenue stream. She wasn't simply living inside a lie. She was drawing a salary from it. She cashed the checks. She accepted the sympathy. And every night, she went to sleep next to a husband who was still fundamentally shattered by what he believed had happened to her. Keith Papini spent those years living in a state of hypervigilance, protecting his broken wife, entirely unaware that the monster he was protecting her from was sleeping in his bed. But while Sherri was perfecting the role of the survivor, the invisible machinery of forensic science was quietly, methodically turning. When the first responders cut her out of her heavy chains on Thanksgiving morning, the clothing she was wearing was cataloged and sent to the California Department of Justice DNA laboratory. The swabs had yielded two critical pieces of evidence: male DNA on her sweatpants and female DNA on her body. Investigators had also photographed and documented the brand on her shoulder in detail. It resolved on closer inspection into a distorted but legible word: Exodus. When detectives eventually asked her what it meant, she offered them a strange, almost literary answer: that it might be a reference to the biblical book of the same name, a story of captivity and deliverance. It was an oddly specific interpretation for a woman who claimed to have no idea who her captors were or why they had chosen it. In retrospect, it reads less like a message left by tormentors and more like a title she had quietly chosen for her own story. For years, the male DNA profile sat in the combined DNA index system, completely anonymous. It matched no known offenders. It was a digital ghost. But biological evidence does not care about narratives, and it does not care about timelines. By 2019, the science of genetic genealogy, the same technology used to unmask the Golden State Killer, had fundamentally altered the landscape of criminal investigations. Law enforcement no longer needed a direct match in a criminal database. They only needed a relative who had taken a commercial DNA test to find out their heritage. In early 2020, the FBI and the California DOJ utilized this technology on the unknown male DNA found on Sherri's clothing. The familial tree branched out. The genetic markers aligned. The net slowly tightened around a specific family line and then around a specific name: James Reyes. When federal investigators pulled his background, the perfectly constructed illusion of the two Hispanic women instantly evaporated. James Reyes was not a cartel enforcer. He was not a human trafficker. He was a quiet, unassuming man living in Southern California. More importantly, he was Sherri Papini's ex-boyfriend. The sheer audacity of the lie began to crystallize in the minds of the detectives. But they did not immediately knock on Sherri's door. They went to Costa Mesa. They went to the source. When law enforcement approached James, they did not find a hardened criminal prepared to defend a conspiracy. They found a man who seemed almost relieved to finally put the burden down. James Reyes did not ask for a lawyer. He did not deny knowing her. He sat down with the authorities and completely dismantled the myth of the Mountain Gate kidnapping, piece by piece, receipt by receipt. He told them everything. He told them about the prepaid phones. He told them about the messages where she claimed she was being abused by her husband and begged him to save her. He confirmed that he rented a dark vehicle, drove to Reading, and picked her up at the exact rural intersection where her phone was later found in the dirt. The contrast between James's absolute transparency and Sherri's elaborate fiction is staggering. He didn't just tell them a story. He handed them the empirical proof of her deception. He provided the car rental records from November 2016. He gave them the toll booth records that placed him on Interstate 5 on the day she vanished. He showed them the bank records for the prepaid phones. And then, he showed them the instruments of her supposed torture. He described the layout of his apartment, a layout that perfectly matched the dark room Sherri had described to the FBI in 2016. He told them about her refusing to eat. He admitted to striking her with a hockey stick, but only because she explicitly commanded him to do so. He told them about the hair cutting. Finally, he told them about the brand. He confirmed that they had purchased a wood-burning tool from a local craft store. He confirmed that she had burned herself. The investigators had their answer. They had the motive, the method, and the timeline. But the mechanism of a federal investigation requires the suspect to lock themselves in the room. They needed to confront her. They needed to watch the mask fall. On August 13, 2020, almost 4 years after she first vanished, a federal agent and a Shasta County detective asked Sherri and Keith Papini to come into an interview room for an update on the case. The environment was sterile. White walls, a small table, a hidden camera in the corner recording every micro-expression. Sherri walked into that room wearing the armor she had worn for years. She was the delicate victim. Keith walked in beside her, holding her hand, acting as her physical and emotional shield. The structure of this interrogation is a masterpiece of psychological pressure. The agents did not walk in and immediately slap handcuffs on the table. They used what is known in law enforcement as the soft approach. They played the role of the sympathetic protectors. For the first portion of the interview, they let her speak. They let her reiterate the lies. They let her talk about the dark room, the awful women, the pain of the branding. They let her build the house of cards right there on the table, knowing exactly how they were going to burn it down. Then the tone in the room subtly shifted. The federal agent leaned forward. He told Sherri that it was a federal crime to lie to an FBI agent. He repeated it, making sure the gravity of the statement hung in the air. He told her that sometimes people who are dealing with difficult situations at home might do things they regret. They might run away. He was offering her a life raft. He was giving her the opportunity to say, "Yes, I ran away. I made a mistake. I'm sorry." A person capable of guilt would have taken the raft. A person exhausted by the weight of a 4-year lie would have broken down and confessed. Sherri Papini did neither. She doubled down. She looked at the agents and vehemently denied running away. She clung to the narrative of the 2 Latina women. She leaned into Keith, seeking his physical reassurance, weaponizing his presence in the room to force the agents to back off. She began to cry, the practiced, breathy sobs of a traumatized woman being re-victimized by the system. When you watch the footage of this interrogation, you are not watching a woman terrified of going to prison. You are watching a narcissist violently resisting a loss of control. The script was changing without her permission, and her only defense mechanism was to perform her victimhood even louder. But the agents were done playing. They placed a photograph on the table. It was a picture of James Reyes. "Do you know this man?" the detective asked. "This is the exact moment the oxygen leaves the room. This is the moment the 2 parallel realities, the grand fiction and the pathetic truth, violently collide." Sherri stared at the photograph. The agents watched her breathing change. They watched her eyes dart, her brain rapidly trying to process the catastrophic breach in her defense. She did not immediately recognize the danger, or perhaps she simply refused to acknowledge it. She initially denied knowing him, calling him a creepy guy from her past, a boy she hadn't seen in nearly 2 decades. The agents told her they had DNA. They told her that the male DNA found on her sweatpants on Thanksgiving morning matched the man in the photograph. They told her they had spoken to James. They told her about the prepaid phones. They told her about the rental car. They told her they knew she stayed in his apartment for 3 weeks. The physical transformation in Sherri at this moment is chilling. She does not confess. The mask does not fall to reveal a remorseful woman. The mask fractures to reveal a desperate, cornered animal willing to say absolutely anything to maintain the illusion of innocence. She pivots. Instantly. She stops denying that she knows James, and immediately tries to weave him into the kidnapping narrative. Through hyperventilating sobs, she suggests that maybe James was involved with the cartel. Maybe he was the one pulling the strings. Maybe the 2 Hispanic women were working for him. She looks at her husband, her eyes wide with manufactured terror, and says, "What if he's the one who took me?" It is a stunning display of pathological self-preservation. Even when presented with absolute, irrefutable proof that her story is a fabrication, her instinct is not to apologize to the husband sitting next to her. Her instinct is to invent a brand new, even more convoluted conspiracy that still leaves her as the innocent victim. She is perfectly willing to send an innocent man, a man who thought he was rescuing her, a man whose apartment she lived in voluntarily, to federal prison for kidnapping just to protect her reputation in a small town. It is worth noting that James Reyes never faced that fate. He cooperated fully, submitted to a polygraph examination, and was never charged with a crime in connection with the case. The man Sherri tried in that interrogation room to recast as her abductor walked away from this story with his record clean, while she walked toward federal charges that would define the rest of her life. But the agents cut through the noise. The detective looks at her, his voice devoid of any of the sympathy he had offered an hour earlier. He says the words that finally shatter the room. "There was no kidnapping. You were staying with him." You have to look at Keith Papini in this moment. For nearly 4 years, this man's entire identity had been constructed around the trauma of his wife's abduction. He had wept on national television. He had fought with strangers on the internet who dared to call her a liar. He had bathed her wounds. He had held her while she cried about the dark room. He had lived every single day carrying the heavy, agonizing burden of her survival. And now, sitting in a sterile interrogation room, he is watching the woman he loves attempt to negotiate her way out of an impossible lie. He hears the agents lay out the evidence. The burner phones, the car rental, the fact that she was staying with an ex-boyfriend in Southern California while he was tearing through the freezing woods of Shasta County, terrified that she was dead in a ditch. Keith does not immediately explode. The human brain cannot process the complete annihilation of its reality that quickly. His reaction is slow, heavy, and devastating. He looks at his wife. He asks her, his voice small and trembling, if it's true. Sherri cannot look him in the eye and tell the truth. She continues to cry. She continues to deflect. She buries her face in her hands and wails about how confusing it all is, how her memory is damaged, how she doesn't understand what is happening. She is still trying to direct the scene, but the audience has finally stopped believing her. Keith slowly pulls his chair away from hers. The physical distance he places between them in that room is the most profound condemnation possible. He stops holding her hand. He puts his head in his hands. He realizes that the monster he had been protecting her from was never in the dark SUV. The monster was the woman who had intentionally orchestrated his absolute terror, just to see if he would bleed for her. The agents let the silence in the room hold. They let Keith sit in the wreckage of his marriage. Even at the end of the interview, as they are preparing to leave, Sherri refuses to concede the narrative. She walks out of that federal building still claiming that she was abducted, still claiming that her memory is just broken, still demanding to be treated as a victim of circumstance rather than the architect of a fraud. This is the chilling reality of a truly pathological need for attention. The truth does not cure it. Evidence does not dismantle it. When confronted with the total destruction of her lie, she simply tried to build a new lie on top of the ashes. It would take another 18 months for the federal wheels to turn completely. The DOJ needed to ensure their case was absolutely airtight before bringing charges. They needed to document every stolen dollar, every false statement, every hour of wasted law enforcement resources. On March 3, 2022, 5.5 years after she vanished into the California wilderness, the performance finally ended. Federal agents arrived at the Papini household. They did not come with yellow ribbons. They did not come with sympathetic smiles. They arrested Sherri Papini. The charges were stark, stripped of all the cinematic drama she had spent years cultivating. She was charged with making false statements to a federal law enforcement officer and engaging in mail fraud. The mail fraud charge stemmed from the $30,000 she had siphoned from the Victim Compensation Fund. The mugshot taken that day is a jarring contrast to the perfectly curated images that had dominated the news cycle years earlier. There is no bright smile. There is no soft, natural lighting. Her hair is long again, pulled back severely from her face. She looks entirely ordinary. She looks like a woman who has finally run out of scripts to read. Shasta County Sheriff Michael Johnson did not mince words when the arrest was announced. He called it a case of calculated deception, driven by narcissistic behavior, and estimated that Sherri Papini had cost public safety in excess of $150,000 in wasted resources, a conservative figure that didn't begin to account for the human cost. The fear instilled in Hispanic women across the region, the thousands of volunteer hours, the emotional toll on a community that had genuinely believed it was hunting for two armed kidnappers. U.S. Attorney Philip Talbert put it more simply. Time and resources that could have gone toward real crimes, toward real victims, had instead been spent chasing a story that never happened. Within days of her arrest, the final pillar of her mask collapsed. Keith Papini, the man who had defended her to the entire world, filed for divorce. He cited irreconcilable differences, but the filings revealed a man who was terrified for the psychological safety of his own children. He requested sole custody. He stated plainly in court documents that his wife was completely incapable of providing a safe, stable environment. The man who had once viewed her as Supermom now recognized her as an active threat to their family's reality. There is something almost unbearably symmetrical about how that marriage ended. It had begun with Keith's absolute, unquestioning trust, the very quality that made Sherri's deception possible in the first place. It ended with a legal filing built entirely around the withdrawal of that trust, a husband finally doing in a courtroom what he could never bring himself to do at their own kitchen table. Naming, in plain language, exactly what his wife was capable of. He realized that the woman he married had never really existed. She was just a character she played when the cameras were rolling, and he was nothing more than a supporting actor who had outlived his usefulness. Sherri Papini was eventually forced to stand in a federal courtroom and do the one thing she had spent her entire life trying to avoid. She had to admit that she was not a victim. She pled guilty. In her statement to the court, she offered a rehearsed apology. She said she was deeply ashamed of her behavior. She said she would work the rest of her life to make amends to her family, her friends, and the community she had terrorized. But true to the psychological framework that built the lie in the first place, the apology felt hollow to the people who had survived her. It sounded like just another script, read by a woman who realized that playing the remorseful sinner was the only role left available to her. She was sentenced to 18 months in federal prison, a remarkably short amount of time for a woman who had stolen years of peace from her husband, her children, and an entire county. The financial reckoning was more substantial than the prison term. As part of her sentence, she was ordered to pay more than $300,000 in restitution, a sum divided among the various agencies she had defrauded and burdened. Roughly $127,000 to the Social Security Administration for the disability payments she had fraudulently collected, and nearly $148,000 to the Shasta County Sheriff's Office to help offset the cost of the investigation she had manufactured. Her defense attorneys, in their sentencing submissions, pointed to past mental health struggles as a contributing factor in her actions, an argument that a federal judge weighed against the calculated, years-long precision of the fraud itself. She served her sentence and was released from custody in August of 2023, transferring briefly to community confinement before her full release that October. The 18 months came and went. The $300,000 will take considerably longer to repay, if it is ever repaid in full. And the years the town of Redding spent looking over its shoulder for two women who never existed cannot be repaid at all. The prison sentence is a legal resolution, but it offers zero emotional closure. The criminal justice system is designed to punish actions, not to cure pathology. It can lock a person in a cell, but it cannot force them to develop empathy. It cannot make them understand the profound, devastating weight of the damage they caused. The public watched the sentencing and felt a cold sense of finality. The hoax was over. The liar was caught. But the darkest truth of the Sherri Papini case isn't found in the courtroom or the prison cell. It's found in the quiet, terrifying realization of what she proved about the people around her, and how easily our deepest empathy can be weaponized by someone who feels absolutely nothing at all. We tend to look for a moral, a lesson, or a clear-eyed warning in a story like this. We want to believe that there is a protective mechanism in the human experience, that if someone is lying on such a grand, destructive scale, the people around them will eventually see the cracks. We want to believe that the truth has its own weight, and that it will inevitably pull the mask down. But the Sherri Papini case suggests something much more unsettling. She did not succeed because she was a brilliant mastermind who played a perfect game. She succeeded because she understood a fundamental, painful truth about the world. We are all desperate to believe in the purity of the stories we are told. The mask wasn't a lie. It was a reflection. It was the version of herself that her community, her husband, and her friends needed her to be. When she performed the role of the devoted mother and the selfless wife, she was giving them exactly what they were looking for. She provided the aesthetic of perfection that we all, in our quiet moments, yearn for in our own lives. Think about what that mask actually required. Not a single dramatic lie told once, but thousands of small, consistent performances repeated daily for years until no one thought to question them. The wrapped presents, the elaborate cakes, the running shoes on Sunrise Drive. Every one of those details was a brick in a wall built specifically so that no one would ever look behind it. That is not the architecture of a woman who snapped. That is the architecture of a woman who planned. When she vanished, she didn't just walk away from her home. She walked away from the obligation to be that person anymore. And she discovered that the world would pay a much higher price to have the version of her that was in pain. She proved that the most powerful thing you can be in our culture is a victim. Go back to that mugshot for a moment. The severe hairstyle, the flat expression, the total absence of the soft lighting that had defined every carefully composed image she'd ever posted. Set it beside the Pinterest boards, the Poshmark listings, the perfectly wrapped birthday presents. Those two images are not really a before and an after. They are the same woman with two different audiences. One version was built for a community that needed a supermom. The other was built for a courtroom that needed a defendant. She understood, better than almost anyone we've covered on this channel, that identity itself could be treated as a costume, put on and taken off depending on who was in the room. Victimhood is the ultimate armor. It silences critics. It demands resources. It turns suspicion into an act of cruelty. Sherri understood that if she could make her suffering visible, if she could make it bleed, if she could make it look like the exact nightmare everyone else was secretly afraid of, no one would ever dare to question her. And for 22 days, no one did. Search parties combed the hills above Interstate 5. Volunteers printed flyers with her face on them and stapled them to telephone poles from Redding to Sacramento. A community that had never met most of its own neighbors organized itself overnight into a single, focused engine of hope. That is not a small thing to manufacture. That is not the byproduct of a lie. For Sherri, it was the entire point of one. We look at the chains, the branding, and the starvation, and we search for the pathology. We look for a diagnosis that explains how a mother could abandon her children to go play out a fantasy in a Costa Mesa apartment. But the most terrifying explanation is also the simplest. She didn't feel like she was abandoning them. She felt like she was upgrading the story. She sat in that apartment for 22 days, listening to the world weep for her, and she didn't feel a flicker of remorse because, in her mind, the people who were searching for her were not victims of her deception. They were the supporting cast of her epic. Consider what that means about the brand on her shoulder, the chains around her wrists, the 22 pounds she starved off her own body. Those weren't things that were done to her. Those were production costs. She looked at her own body the way a director looks at a set, and she decided how much of it needed to be destroyed in order to make the illusion unbreakable. There is a word for a person who can do that to themselves without flinching, and it isn't victim. The trauma she caused, the terror she instilled in the women of Redding, the psychological scarring of her own husband, the confusion and shame of her children, is not a regrettable side effect. It is the legacy. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that legacy actually cost. Keith Papini spent 5.5 years defending a story he believed with his entire heart, only to watch it collapse into federal charges and a request for sole custody. He had once looked at his wife with what can only be described as reverence. By the end, his own court filings stated, in plain and devastating language, that she was incapable of providing a safe and stable environment for their own children. That is not the story of a marriage that ended. That is the story of a man who realized years too late that the woman he built a life with had never fully existed outside of the role she was playing for him. The women of Redding paid a different price. For months, mothers in that community stopped running alone. They stopped letting their children walk to school unaccompanied. A city that had defined itself by its safety, by its quiet trust in the space between neighbors, spent years looking over its shoulder for two kidnappers who were never real. Sherri didn't just steal time and money from the system. She stole a community's sense of its own safety, and she never once had to answer for that loss in a courtroom, because there is no law against manufacturing fear in people who were never named in the indictment. And then there is the money, which is somehow the least surprising part of this entire case and still manages to feel obscene. $30,000 funneled out of a fund that exists specifically for people who have survived violent crime. Money that was meant for someone recovering from a genuine assault, a genuine kidnapping, a genuine act of cruelty inflicted on them by another human being. Sherri filed the paperwork, checked the boxes, and let the state of California hand her a check for injuries she inflicted on herself in a rented apartment. It is almost beside the point that $30,000 is a relatively small sum in the context of everything else she took. What matters is what it reveals. She didn't just want the sympathy. She wanted it monetized. She wanted the system built to help real victims to formally certify that her suffering counted. That single detail collapses any argument that this began as something spontaneous, something that spiraled out of her control before she knew what she was doing. You do not accidentally fill out a victim compensation claim. You do not accidentally list your injuries, your dates, your damages, and mail it to a state agency. That is a decision made with total clarity, months after the chains had already come off, by a woman who understood exactly what she had done and saw no reason to stop benefiting from it. And then there is the cost that outlives her case entirely. Every investigator who worked the Papini file, every officer who now takes a missing persons report from a frightened family, does so with just a little more suspicion than they did in October of 2016. Somewhere, a genuine victim of abduction, someone telling the absolute truth about the worst thing that has ever happened to them, will be met with a flicker of doubt that Sherri Papini put there. That is the quiet, compounding interest on a lie like this one. It doesn't just cost the people in the story. It taxes everyone who tells a similar story after her. This is the part of the mask that never gets discussed enough. A hoax this convincing doesn't just damage the people who believed it. It rations out suspicion to everyone who comes after, including the people who are telling the truth. When we turn the final page on her story, we are left with a quiet, lingering discomfort that doesn't resolve. We want to believe that we would have seen through it. We want to believe that we would have noticed the discrepancies, that we would have known the difference between a tragedy and a production. But we wouldn't have. We would have tied the yellow ribbons just as tightly. We would have shared the flyers on our social media pages. We would have cried in our living rooms when we heard she was found. We would have done exactly what she counted on us to do. That is the uncomfortable inheritance of this case. It doesn't just ask us to judge Sherri Papini. It asks us to recognize a version of ourselves in every single person who believed her, because there was nothing unusually gullible about the people of Redding. They responded the way any community would respond to a missing mother of two. They responded with generosity. And that generosity is exactly what she was counting on when she chose her own community to deceive. Sherri Papini didn't just break the trust of a small town. She revealed the vulnerability of our collective empathy. She showed us that the same capacity we have to care for one another, the same instinct that makes us want to protect the innocent and search for the lost, is a mirror that can be turned against us. There is no clean resolution to that fact. We cannot simply decide to trust less, to withhold our empathy until every story has been independently verified, because a community that does that has already lost something essential about what makes it a community in the first place. The people of Redding weren't wrong to search for her. They were only wrong about who she really was. Those are two very different failures, and only one of them belongs to them. It is tempting at this point in the story to look for the single moment where Sherri Papini became capable of this. A childhood wound, a diagnosis, a hidden history that explains the woman who could brand her own shoulder and call it evidence. That search is understandable. It is also, in a case like this one, largely a comfort we give ourselves. Not every act of profound cruelty comes with an origin story neat enough to fit into a documentary chapter. Sometimes the explanation is simply that a person discovered, at some point in her adult life, that she was better at performing suffering than she was at tolerating an ordinary one, and she never found a reason compelling enough to stop. What makes the case endure, long after the sentencing and the divorce and the news cycle moved on, is not the mechanics of how she pulled it off. Chains and hose clamps and a self-inflicted brand are shocking, but they are logistics. What endures is the psychological architecture underneath them. The realization that the most convincing performance of trauma any of us will ever witness might not come from someone who suffered the most. It might come from someone who understood, with total clarity, exactly what an audience needs to see in order to stop asking questions. The mask didn't fall because someone finally looked close enough to see the lie. The mask fell because she simply stopped caring if we saw it. Even the DNA evidence that finally cracked the case wasn't the product of some brilliant detective work chasing her down. It was a database match, a piece of biology she couldn't script or negotiate with. The one part of the performance she couldn't control was the one part that finally ended it. And even after she was unmasked, even after the federal agents had the DNA and the rental car and the confession, the question remains. If she hadn't made that one mistake with the DNA, if she hadn't left behind the one piece of evidence that biology couldn't ignore, how much longer would she have continued the performance? She never stopped believing in the power of the story. She just ran out of audience. And somewhere, someone is still explaining it to themselves, still deciding quietly how much of their own truth they're willing to sacrifice for a story the world might actually stop and listen to.